David Ehrenfeld's denunciation of human arrogance, like his call for spiritual action, has deep roots in the Jewish tradition from which he comes. He denies the prevalent view that the biblical religions are the source of human chauvinism towards nature. This view traces back to an influential essay written by historian Lynn White, Jr. in 1967, called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. White argued in this essay that Christianity in particular had preached man's destiny to dominate and exploit nature. David Ehrenfeld disagrees.
Yes, there's the famous two verses in Genesis 1, chapters 26 and chapter 28, in which Adam is told to go out and take dominion over the earth and to subdue it. And that's pretty terrible sounding, isn't it? And that, according to Lynn White, gave a license to Christians and to Jews, although I think he's less concerned with Jews, gave a license to Christians to go and destroy. Well, this is all very nice, sort of in retrospect. But in fact, it was never interpreted. Those verses were never interpreted that way, either by the early Jewish sages or by the Christian church fathers. Nobody interpreted it that way. Let me read to you an extract from Ecclesiastes Rabbah, which is a commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes, which was first redacted in the 8th century. Now, this is 1,200 years ago that it was written down and is probably older than that. At any rate, the point is that this was not a time when people were worried about the environmental crisis. So let me read that to you. In the hour when the Holy One, blessed be He, created the first man, He took him and let him pass before all of the trees of the Garden of Eden, and said to him, See my works, how fine and excellent they are. Now all that I am going to create for you I have already created. Think about this, and do not corrupt and desolate my world, for if you corrupt it, there will be no one to set it right after you. Now, think of the power and grandeur of this. But these are people who are writing in the 8th century, in the Dark Ages, is what we call them. How in accord is that with the thesis of Lynn White that the early Jews and Christians and modern Jews and Christians have taken a license to destroy from the Bible? Here's another little commentary. This is from the Talmud, the great Jewish commentary on the law. Just a little 4 lines. Our masters taught, man was created on the eve of the Sabbath, and for what reason? So that in case his heart grew proud, one might say to him, even the gnat was in creation before you were there. I mean, isn't that an extraordinary kind of a statement? In the arrogance of humanism, I very carefully, I of course had considered this article of Lynn White's in the paperback edition, which is still available, much more than in the original hardcover. And so I put 2 quotes, one to start the book and one to end. And the quote I started the book with was from the book of Job. Is it by your wisdom that the hawk soars and spreads his wings towards the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? Where God is saying to Job, I created this, you didn't. Really, who do you think you are? And then I ended the book with a brief quotation from Isaiah, and this is a modern Jewish translation, and I think a good translation of the Hebrew. It was your skill and your science that led you astray, and you thought to yourself, I am, and there is none but me. That, I think, really sums it up. What I'm talking about when I'm saying that we have to recapture some kind of spiritual dimension in our relationship to the world, and a little bit of humility, too.
This raises a question about where our attention should be directed, I think. There's a lot of language about saving the planet and so on, right? Which seems to me it directs attention outwards. And I wonder if that's good, whether we can deal with this without directing attention inwards, without seeing that it's we who are being corrupted and not just the environment as a sort of a colorless, tasteless, odorless out there.
Yes, I'm sitting here with a book at my elbow by Wendell Berry, The Unsettling of America. And I think for many of us, Wendell Berry is the first and the last word on the whole subject of where the world is heading and where it ought to be heading. And Berry has always said that conservation begins at home, that environmentalism begins at home. And this, I think, is absolutely critical. One has to put one's own internal house in order, and then go to the community, and then if there's any luxury of time or energy left over, then you go on to wider things. I think some people have to have, in a sense, some of that time and energy left over, because there has to be some spreading of this idea around the world and some communication. But first you start at home, and then it has to extend from oneself. You can't be a hermit and be an environmentalist. Just as, for instance, you can't be a hermit and be a practicing Jew. You have to have a community.
I'd like to ask you finally about what I'll call environmentalism, for want of a better term, meaning all those persons who are concerned with this. And this is a movement which seems divided in many ways, but which ranges certainly from a managerial perspective at one end, right? An attitude which is confident that sustainable development is possible, that you can have growth and environmental protection, however it's phrased. And at the other end, one has a biocentric perspective, let's say, descending from Leopold's famous saying that we should be only a plain citizen of the biotic community. It seems to me that coming out of your Jewish roots, you take a different view, neither one nor the other.
Yeah, let me try to answer your question by describing the Jewish attitude towards work and the Sabbath, which I think is the ultimate, for me at least, the ultimate way of stating this problem. In Judaism, you're supposed to work 6 days and rest on the seventh. On the seventh day, on the Sabbath, which for us is Saturday, or it actually starts Friday evening at sundown, you are supposed to stop working, and there's 3 things you have to do if you are going to observe the Sabbath correctly. You can't create anything. I mean anything. You can't, if you get an idea for a book, you cannot write it down on a piece of paper. That's very painful for an author, and it happens to me all the time. And I wonder, will I remember this till after sundown on Saturday? And sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't, and I've stopped worrying about it. If you're a gardener, you can't plant a seed. That's a creative act. You can't do it. You also can't destroy anything. That's the second thing you can't do. Again, if you're a gardener, you can't, and you see a weed growing in your garden, you can't pull it up. You can't kill an insect pest. You can't shoot a rabbit or anything of that sort on the Sabbath. The third thing that you're supposed to do is a positive injunction, which is to celebrate the Sabbath and celebrate the fullness of the earth that was given to people to live in, to work in, and to enjoy. So you have this prohibition against creating or destroying, which means you cannot be a manager. You can't be a steward even, in any sense. You've got to leave it alone, and it will continue all by itself. It's a wonderful lesson. You also have to learn how to enjoy it, and that's the other part of the lesson. People were told you had to have the confidence, in a sense, in the earth and in the creator of the earth that says, I'm going to just rest for one day. I'm going to leave it alone. Now, I think that stewardship without the idea of the Sabbath is bound to go wrong. Without this idea of the Sabbath, without some idea of a built-in restraint, then the steward eventually becomes very arrogant. Hence my title, The Arrogance of Humanism. The steward says, I'm really the king. You know, the late J.R.R. Tolkien, in his book, his wonderful Ring trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, has this dilemma of a steward who says, how long do I have to stay a steward if the king doesn't show up? when do I become a king? And the man who asked this question is told by his father, who is the steward, even 10,000 years wouldn't be enough. Essentially, there is never a time when a steward becomes a king. Well, I think that there's a great temptation for stewards to want to play king, to want to play God, and without some kind of a restraint that's built in at a regular basis, a kind of constant reminder, you're not running the show, you can't run the show. You don't know enough to run the show, and you never will, and you're only going to mess it up if you have that attitude. Without that idea, then I think that stewardship is bound to go awry and to go amiss. I think that the idea of the Sabbath for Jews, and perhaps for Christians too, introduces this idea of restraint, which is so essential to keep stewardship on the right track. So I think that stewardship is the only hope, but I think it has to have some kind of restraint built into it.
David, thank you so much.
You're welcome.